This is the second part of the lecture on Ronald Reagan. The economic recovery, beginning in 1983 and lasting throughout the rest of the 1980s, brought Reagan strong political support from the American people. In the 1984 election, Reagan scored a huge victory over Democrat Walter Mondale, winning in a landslide. Though the rates of economic growth did not come close to rivaling those of the 1950s and 1960s, and though most of the gains were seen by wealthier Americans, Wall Street, not Main Street, saw most of the gains. Large numbers of Americans came to feel more hopeful and optimistic with the revival of the economy. Popular new household gadgets such as VCRs and phone answering machines consumed much of the newfound wealth. The decade saw a celebration of the accumulation of wealth to an extent not witnessed since the 1920s. TV shows such as Dallas and Dynasty, which celebrated extremely wealthy families. The celebration of the yuppie, the young urban professional. This was all a celebration fully sanctified by Reagan, who said in 1983, quote, "What I want to see above all is that this remains a country where someone can always get rich." Many, however, were left behind in this scramble for prosperity. Blue-collar workers continued to struggle with job losses, family farmers with foreclosure, and women and minorities with pay gaps and general economic inequality. Reaganomics, Reagan's economic policy, or philosophy also, which focused on major tax cuts and very high defense spending, provided some economic stimulus, but also ballooned federal deficits, whose interest we're all still paying on in terms of the massive federal debt that we have now. That was also ballooned by subsequent presidents, including George W. Bush and Barack Obama. As a percentage of the gross national product, the federal deficit went from 33 to 53% during Reagan's tenure as president. Reagan's final years in office were somewhat darkened by the Iran-Contra scandal. Determined to allow no new Cubas in the hemisphere on his watch, Reagan backed aid to groups fighting communism and socialism throughout the hemisphere. In Nicaragua, where he backed the Contras, who were fighting the Sandinista government, and also in El Salvador and Guatemala. Elsewhere around the globe, Reagan supported freedom fighters in Afghanistan, Cambodia, Mozambique, and Angola. His Reagan doctrine upheld the need to back forces fighting communism all over the world. Reagan was determined to back the Contras against the socialist or communist Sandinista government. The problem was that congressional Democrats had just passed the Boland Amendment, which outlawed American assistance to the Contras for the purpose of overthrowing the Sandinista government. Reagan and company decided to find secret ways to fund the Contras. While it's not clear if Reagan specifically knew of the use by aides such as Oliver North and William McFarland, the use of money from arms sales to the pariah state of Iran to fund the Contras, aides felt they were acting on the president's wishes, undoubtedly. When word of all this leaked out in late 1986, it produced the most significant scandal of the Reagan administration, hurting the president's popularity and credibility. Much followed hearings the following summer Congressional hearings involving Fawn Hall and Oliver North didn't help matters. Though Reagan's successful symmetry with Gorbachev in late 1987 smoothed things over somewhat, and Reagan left office in January of 1989 with high approval ratings. How to assess the Reagan presidency? It was certainly highly consequential. As a candidate for the presidency in 2008, Barack Obama said he wanted to have a transformative presidency, a la Reagan, and unlike that of Bill Clinton, the husband of his primary Democratic opponent, Hillary Clinton. Reagan won numerous converts to conservatism over the course of his presidency, and arguably turned the nation center-right, a position from which I believe it hasn't really deviated since then. The idea that the private sector can solve social problems such as poverty better than the government caught on with many Americans, and this was an idea that Reagan pushed hard. Barack Obama, upon becoming president in 2009, spoke of restoring Americans' faith in the ability of government to solve problems. And in that, he was really trying to reverse what Reagan had done, Reagan's conservatism had done. And I would argue that Obama had only limited success in that goal. Reaganomics, while swelling the budget deficit, the federal budget debt, and also the deficits, annual deficits, and leaving many Americans behind, did appear to prompt a several-year period of economic growth. Many Americans felt more optimistic by the mid and late 1980s than they had in the early 1980s and at the end of the 1970s. Reagan's toughness on the Soviets, his ramping up of defense spending, and his tough posture toward communism and the Soviet Union, coupled with his willingness to negotiate arms limitation with Gorbachev, played an important role in the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, which happened shortly after Reagan left office, happening between 1989 and 1981. Reagan's insistence that the Soviet system was deeply flawed and was destined not to last, which clashed with the opinions of most of his foreign policy advisors, and certainly the CIA and most in the State Department, proved a great force in the fight against communism. And Reagan didn't do it alone, certainly, but he probably had more effect than any other individual in the ending of the Cold War. And this is undoubtedly his greatest legacy. Thanks.